At my sister's wedding reception, in front of 200 guests, my mother grabbed the microphone, pointed at me, and announced that I would be moving into my sister's new mansion as her live-in help. Everyone applauded. Nobody knew that 11 days earlier, I had won $122 million. Before we dive into my story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you're new here, please subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. Stay with me until the end because my family had no idea what was coming. Bryn's wedding was everything my mother had dreamed of: white roses, crystal chandeliers, expensive dresses, and guests filling every table. Vivian smiled proudly as she described my new responsibility, making it sound like an honor. I stood beside my sister in my bridesmaid dress, pretending everything was fine. My father, Harold, wouldn't look at me. Chase, Bryn's new husband, seemed amused. I finally slipped into the restroom and locked the door. Tears came as I realized how easily my family had decided my future without asking me. Then my phone buzzed. Foster, my lawyer, had sent one message: "The trust is ready. One signature remains." I wiped my face, returned to the reception, and smiled. "Let them have tonight," I whispered. 3 days after the wedding, I sat across from Foster in a quiet law office downtown, staring at a stack of documents that represented a future my family knew nothing about. "Read everything carefully," he said. "Once you sign, the trust becomes active." I nodded and began turning the pages. The money still felt unreal. 11 days earlier, I had stopped at a gas station after a miserable day at work. I was exhausted, frustrated, and desperate to get home. While paying for coffee, I noticed the lottery display beside the register. I bought one ticket without thinking much about it. That night, I checked the numbers while sitting alone at my kitchen table. At first, I thought I had made a mistake. I checked again. Then again. Every number matched. My hands started shaking. I called the official number printed on the ticket and followed every instruction they gave me. Within hours, I understood that my life had changed permanently. The prize was $122 million. But instead of telling my parents, I told no one. I remembered how quickly my family made decisions for me. They had always praised me for being dependable, but somehow that praise had become an excuse to expect everything from me. If Bryn needed something, I handled it. If Vivian had an appointment, I adjusted my schedule. If Harold had a problem, I was expected to help solve it. Nobody asked what I wanted. They simply assumed I would manage. That history became painfully clear when Vivian called the following Monday. "So you can move in next weekend," she said cheerfully. "Bryn will need help organizing the house before the honeymoon." I stared at my phone. "You already decided that?" "Of course," she replied. "We discussed it at the wedding." No discussion had included me. I could have told her everything then. I could have said I had enough money to walk away from every obligation they had placed on me. Instead, I simply said, "I'll think about it." After the call ended, I sat quietly, realizing that my silence was no longer weakness. It was protection. At Foster's office, I signed the final documents. He collected the papers and placed them into a secure folder. "You understand what happens next?" he asked. "Yes. Your privacy becomes extremely important. People will treat you differently once they know." I looked toward the window. For the first time, I understood that revealing the truth too early would give everyone the chance to rewrite their behavior before I discovered who they really were. Foster studied me for a moment before adding, "Once this becomes public, there's no taking it back. Choose your moment." I nodded. "I will." And for the first time, I wasn't waiting for my family to decide what happened next. The following Saturday, I arrived at Bryn and Chase's mansion with 2 suitcases. I had made my decision. Not because I accepted the role my family had assigned me, but because I wanted to see how far they were willing to take it. The house looked completely different in daylight. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a landscaped backyard, and expensive furniture filled every room. Bryn was still surrounded by unopened wedding gifts when she greeted me at the entrance. "You're finally here," she said. "I was worried you might change your mind." I gave her a small smile. "Where should I put my things?" She pointed toward a hallway near the back of the house. "Your room is down there." I followed her and stopped when she opened a narrow door beside the laundry area. Inside was a small bed, a dresser, and barely enough space for my 2 suitcases. Bryn noticed my expression. "It's temporary," she said quickly. "We're still figuring out the house." I didn't argue. She handed me a printed schedule. Laundry on Mondays and Thursdays. Kitchen before breakfast. Guest rooms whenever we have visitors. Chase likes everything done a certain way. I looked down at the paper. There were 12 tasks listed. None of them included asking what I wanted. Anything else? I asked. Just be available. She walked away before I could respond. I placed my bags beside the bed and closed the door. For several minutes I simply stood there. Then I remembered the conversation I had that morning with Rourke, the financial advisor Foster had recommended. He had shown me projections that made the number in my trust feel even more real. My money was no longer just a figure on paperwork. It could purchase companies, properties, investments, and opportunities one had never imagined. Yet my family had given me a room beside the washing machines. That contrast didn't make me angry. It made me observant. Later that afternoon, Chase passed me in the hallway carrying a box. "You're lucky they're letting you stay here," he said casually. "Rent isn't cheap around here." I looked at him. "I know." He smiled, apparently satisfied with his own generosity, and continued upstairs. I returned to my room and opened my second suitcase. Inside were ordinary clothes, a notebook, and the small folder containing details of my new financial life. I didn't need to prove anything yet. That evening, while the mansion grew quiet, I opened my phone and sent Foster a short message. "Start moving pieces." He replied almost immediately. "Understood." I placed the phone face down. For the first time, I wasn't simply watching my family make plans for me. I was making plans of my own. My first move had nothing to do with my family. It started at the accounting firm where I worked. For years I had watched the company operate from the inside. I knew which departments made money, which clients were dependable, and which decisions were slowly hurting the business. Nobody considered me important enough to notice those details, but that suited me perfectly. With Rourke's help, I created a private investment structure and began purchasing shares through it. My name never appeared in the conversations. My boss continued treating me like the same employee who arrived every morning, answered emails, prepared reports, and stayed late when deadlines approached. That was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't trying to control the company overnight. I wanted a position strong enough to protect myself if my circumstances ever became public. Meanwhile, I started examining Harold's hardware businesses. That investigation changed the way I viewed my father. From the outside, his stores looked successful. There were several locations, familiar signs, loyal customers, and years of history behind the company. The financial records told a different story. Debt had been piling up quietly. Some loans were approaching renewal dates. Several suppliers had tightened their payment terms, and cash flow was becoming increasingly dependent on borrowed money. Harold had hidden the seriousness of it from everyone. Even Vivian seemed unaware. I could have solved the problem immediately. That I kept watching. Then the family began using my new role as another opportunity to diminish me. During a Sunday visit, Vivian introduced me to an aunt as Bryn's help. She didn't say my name. My aunt looked at me awkwardly before asking, "Is that what you're doing now?" I forced a polite smile. "For now." Vivian continued talking as though I weren't standing there. I didn't correct her. There was something useful about being underestimated. People revealed more when they believed you had no power. That evening, I returned to the mansion and opened the financial documents Rourke had prepared. The numbers surrounding Harold's company were worse than I expected. Then my phone rang. It was my father. His voice sounded different. "Delaney, have you heard anything from the bank?" "No." "Why?" There was a long pause. "It's nothing. I just wanted to check." I knew immediately that it wasn't nothing. After we ended the call, I sat quietly, thinking about the man who had spent years making me feel responsible for everyone else's problems. Now he had one he couldn't hide. I didn't feel victorious. I felt certain. The next morning, I received another report from Rourke. A payment on one of Harold's major loans had been missed. I stared at the date. This wasn't a distant possibility anymore. Something was beginning to collapse. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen when my family discovered that the person they had dismissed so easily was the one person capable of changing everything. 2 weeks later, Bryn hosted a housewarming dinner to celebrate her new life with Chase. From the moment guests began arriving, the mansion felt like a completely different world. Expensive cars filled the driveway, music drifted through the rooms, and people admired every detail Bryn had chosen. I was given instructions before the first guest entered. Keep everything moving, Bryn said. Food, drinks, plates. Don't disappear unless you're finished. I nodded. For the next several hours, I carried trays between the dining room and kitchen while guests laughed around me. Nobody asked why I wasn't sitting with them. One woman stopped me near the staircase. Are you part of the catering staff? Before I could answer, Bryn laughed. No, she's family. She's helping us out. The woman smiled awkwardly and moved away. I continued working. What surprised me wasn't the workload. It was how comfortable everyone became with the idea that I belonged beneath them. Chase was worse. When I brought him a drink, he glanced at the empty tray in my hands. See? You're useful after all. A few guests laughed. I said nothing. Later, Bryn asked me to bring another round of glasses. I returned to the kitchen and stood alone beside the sink. My hands were trembling. I turned on the water, lowered my head, and let myself cry quietly for a few minutes. Then I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. I wasn't crying because I believed them. I was crying because I finally understood how little they thought of me. My phone vibrated. It was Rourke. The trust has officially closed. Everything is confirmed. I stared at those words. The number attached to my name was now real, protected, and entirely under my control. I could have walked into that dining room and changed the balance instantly. Instead, I dried my face and returned with another tray. Near the end of the evening, Chase gathered several guests around him and began talking about responsibility. Some people are lucky, he said. They get taken care of without having to accomplish much themselves. His eyes landed on me. The room went quiet for a second. I placed the glasses on the table. Then I smiled. Not the nervous smile I had worn at the wedding. Not the polite expression I'd used to avoid confrontation. This one was different. It was calm. Almost amused. Chase frowned. What? Nothing, I replied. I turned away before he could see how much had changed inside me. That night, after everyone left, I returned to my small room and opened Rourke's latest report. The trust had given me extraordinary financial freedom. But money wasn't the real lesson. The real lesson was that my family had shown me exactly who they were when they believed I had nothing. Now I knew. The next phase required patience. I had no interest in confronting my family while emotions were still controlling the situation. If I wanted lasting protection, every decision had to be legal, documented, and carefully considered. Rourke and Foster spent several evenings reviewing the financial structure surrounding Harold's business and Bryn's mansion. One document caught my attention. The house wasn't fully paid for. Harold had used the property as security for financing connected to his struggling businesses. Bryn and Chase believed the mansion represented their financial success, but a significant portion of its value was tied to obligations they barely understood. I asked Foster a simple question. What happens if those obligations change hands? He studied me before answering. That depends on the agreements. But in certain circumstances, the holder of the debt gains substantial legal rights. I understood immediately. I wasn't interested in taking someone's home away. I wanted control over a financial position my family had never bothered to explain to me. After several meetings, Foster began negotiations through the trust. Everything was conducted privately. No one in my family knew my name was connected to the discussions. Even Harold continued trying to solve his financial problems through his existing lenders, unaware that another party was preparing to acquire the relevant debt. The process took time. There were contracts to examine, valuations to verify, and legal conditions that had to be satisfied. I stayed completely out of sight. Meanwhile, life inside the mansion continued normally. Bryn complained about decorating expenses. Chase talked confidently about future plans. Harold called occasionally, pretending everything was under control. I listened. I learned more from what people avoided saying than from what they actually told me. One evening, Foster called. We have an agreement. I sat upright. Is everything finalized? Almost. The final documents are being processed. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I looked around the little room where my family had placed me. The walls were plain. The furniture was cheap. Outside my door, I could hear Bryn laughing with Chase. Soon, the financial reality beneath their comfortable life would be very different. The final confirmation arrived the following afternoon. The debt had been transferred into an entity controlled by my trust. I was now the person standing behind a financial obligation my family depended upon. Nobody in that house knew. Foster reminded me that ownership came with responsibilities. I agreed. This wasn't about threatening anyone. It was about making sure that the people who had treated my future as something they could control would finally have to face the consequences of their own decisions. That night, I placed the documents in a locked drawer. For months, my family had made choices while assuming I had no power to challenge them. Now that assumption had an expiration date. I turned off the light and closed the drawer. The first move was complete. The next one would happen when I decided they were ready to see the truth. A few weeks later, Harold invited the extended family over for Sunday dinner. He called it a celebration. According to him, the worst of his business troubles were finally behind him. A new financial arrangement had supposedly given him enough breathing room to stabilize everything. I knew the truth. The money he believed had saved him was connected to the very structure I now controlled. Nobody at the table suspected anything. By then my role in the household had become routine. I helped prepare the dining room, carried dishes, and made sure everyone had what they needed. Relatives arrived throughout the afternoon, congratulating Harold and asking about the company. He accepted every compliment with a confident smile. "You see," he told one of my uncles, "sometimes you just need the right solution." I lowered my eyes and continued arranging plates. Vivian noticed me. "Delaney, don't forget the drinks." A few relatives laughed. She smiled as though she had made an innocent joke. Then she raised her glass and began speaking about the family. She praised Harold for keeping his business alive, Bryn for building a beautiful home, and Chase for becoming such a strong husband. Finally, she looked at me. "And Delaney has found her purpose too," she said. "She's become very helpful around the house." The room filled with approving murmurs. I stood beside the dining table holding an empty serving tray. Nobody asked whether I was happy. Nobody wondered whether this was the life I wanted. Vivian simply continued talking. "For some people, being needed is enough." That sentence stayed with me. I set the tray down. Then I reached into my pocket and touched my phone. Foster was waiting outside. He had arrived earlier and parked several houses away, exactly as we had planned. I didn't call him immediately. I wanted to give my family one final opportunity to understand that something had changed. Harold began discussing the future of his business. He spoke about expansion, new contracts, and eventually paying off the financing that had rescued him. I listened carefully. Every word made the next conversation more necessary. When dinner was served, I quietly sent Foster a message. "Come in." Less than a minute later, the front door opened. Everyone turned. Foster walked into the dining room carrying a slim leather folder. Harold immediately recognized him as a lawyer. His smile disappeared. "What are you doing here?" Foster looked directly at him. "Mr. Hale, I need to speak with you about the financing connected to this property." The room fell silent. Vivian looked confused. Bryn stopped eating. Chase leaned forward. Harold slowly stood. Why would a lawyer be discussing my house? Foster placed the folder on the table. "Because there is something you were never told." I remained standing near the doorway. For the first time, nobody was looking at me as household help. They were waiting to hear what Foster had to say. Foster opened the folder and placed several documents on the dining table. Harold stared at them. "What exactly is this?" Foster remained composed. "The mortgage attached to this property was recently transferred to a private trust." Bryn immediately looked toward her father. "You told us everything was under control." "I thought it was," Harold replied. Chase leaned forward. "Who owns the trust?" Foster didn't answer immediately. Instead, he explained that the transfer was completely legal and that the trust now held the financial interest connected to the mansion. Vivian's expression tightened. "This makes no sense. Who would buy something like that?" Foster finally looked across the room. "The beneficiary authorized me to disclose the information tonight." Harold's face changed. "Who?" Foster turned toward me. "Delaney." Silence swallowed the room. Bryn stared at me as if she had never seen me before. Chase actually laughed. "No." I said nothing. Vivian shook her head. "That isn't possible." Foster continued calmly. "Delaney established a private financial trust after receiving a substantial lottery award. The trust has now acquired the mortgage position associated with this property." Harold slowly lowered himself into his chair. "How much?" I stepped forward. "The full amount of the transferred obligation." His eyes widened. When did this happen? Recently. Bryn looked between Foster and me. You've been planning this? I've been protecting myself, I answered. Chase's confidence disappeared. But you were living here. Yes. In that room. Yes. He looked genuinely confused. You had all that money and still stayed here? I glanced around the dining room. I needed to know whether anyone would treat me differently if they thought I had nothing. Vivian's voice trembled. You won the lottery? I nodded. 11 days before Bryn's wedding. Harold covered his face with one hand. For years he had assumed I was the daughter who needed guidance. Now he was sitting across from the person who controlled a major financial obligation attached to his business and his daughter's home. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I simply explained that the money had been secured properly and that the trust was acting within the law. Then I looked at Bryn. You wanted me here because you believed I had nowhere else to go. Her expression hardened. That isn't fair. I shook my head. No. What wasn't fair was deciding my life without ever asking me. Foster gathered the documents. I remained standing. The family that had once spoken over me was finally silent. Then I said the words I had been carrying for weeks. I'm not here to take the house. I'm here to remind you I never needed one. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Bryn pushed her chair back. You planned all of this, she said. You waited until we were comfortable, then used our situation against us. I looked at her calmly. I didn't create your financial problems. You bought the debt. I bought an investment through a legal trust. You didn't know because nobody bothered to ask what was happening in my life. Bryn's anger softened for a moment, but Chase stepped in. This is manipulation. I turned toward him. No. Manipulation would have been pretending to have power while secretly controlling you. I never interfered with your decisions. You made them yourselves. Harold finally spoke. Delaney, we're still your family. That sentence would once have been enough to make me surrender. Not anymore. I know, I said. That's why this hurts. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. We never meant for you to feel unwanted. I almost laughed but stopped myself. You didn't have to mean it. You showed it. The room became painfully quiet. I explained what would happen next. I wasn't demanding that Harold abandon his business or forcing Bryn out of her home. I was giving him a reasonable period to restructure his finances and meet the obligations attached to the property. But there is one condition, I said. Harold looked at me. What? No more pretending. He lowered his eyes. If the business is struggling, admit it. If you need help, ask honestly. But don't decide that I'm responsible for fixing everything simply because I'm the daughter who always says yes. He nodded slowly. Bryn crossed her arms. So what happens to us? That depends on what you choose to do next. She looked genuinely lost. The argument that had begun with accusations was slowly turning into something quieter. Eventually the others left the dining room, giving us space. Bryn remained behind. For the first time in years, there was no audience around us. She sat across from me, her anger replaced by confusion. Why didn't you just tell us? I looked at her for a long moment. Would you have treated me the same way? She didn't answer. That silence said enough. I continued gently. I didn't need everyone to worship me because I had money. I wanted the same respect you gave people you thought were important. Bryn looked down at the table. I was cruel. Yes, I said. You were. He swallowed. I don't know how to fix it. You don't fix something like this with one apology. She nodded. Then what do I do? Start by changing how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. For once, I didn't feel responsible for making her feel better. I simply stood and walked away, leaving her with the question she had finally asked herself. The first morning in my new home felt strangely peaceful. There were no chore lists waiting on the counter, no one calling my name from another room, and no expectations attached to every ordinary decision. I could finally wake up and decide what my day would look like. Harold eventually stabilized his business through difficult but honest changes. He sold unnecessary assets, renegotiated agreements, and stopped hiding the problems that had nearly overwhelmed him. His recovery wasn't easy, but it was his responsibility, and for once he accepted that. Bryn was different too. When she contacted me, she didn't ask about the money or the mansion. She simply asked whether we could talk. I agreed. She apologized without making excuses. She admitted that she had accepted the family's view of me because it benefited her. I treated you like you mattered less, she said. You did, I replied. She lowered her eyes and accepted my answer. That meant more than a dramatic apology would have. I didn't immediately return to the relationship we once had. Trust couldn't be repaired in a single conversation. Instead, I gave her room to show whether her words were genuine. Eventually, I understood something I had missed for years. The lottery hadn't made me valuable. It had only given me the freedom to stop tolerating people who refused to see my value. My fortune gave me choices, but the most important choice had nothing to do with money. I could finally say no without feeling guilty. I could leave situations that diminished me. I could build a life without constantly wondering whether my family approved. When I think about Bryn's wedding now, I remember standing beneath those chandeliers, forcing myself to smile while everyone celebrated a future they had chosen for me. That woman didn't know what was coming, but she was already beginning to understand something important. Her life belonged to her. That freedom meant more to me than the $122 million ever could.